Good morning. I'm delighted to be here among you. I was thinking this morning, as I was sitting here, when was the first time that I heard about Conestoga Mennonite Church? And I know my memory is fuzzy as I get older, but I think it was when I was working at Lancaster Mennonite School and a group of boys drove to LMS together in a really weird truck. That's all I know. I don't know if I remember the name right. I think it was called the Yummy Tummy Truck, but I may be right. But that's when I first learned about Conestoga. That was a long time ago. My husband and I live in Strasburg, and we have 2 children and 2 beautiful granddaughters that keep our lives busy as we make some transitions from full-time work to retirement. So we're finding our way. I also want to let you know that every Friday, I'm doing a short intern time at Garden Spot Village, and I am delighted on Fridays to always have some contact with Mabel Kurtz. She is just a delightful presence in my day. She attends a devotional that her group of people in the household that she's a part of when they meet together, and I've just found her to be such a delight. And she knew I was coming here this morning, so she's keeping engaged with what's going on here. There's a story told of a man who became convinced he was losing his hearing. He went to a specialist who gave him a thorough checkup. The doctor pulled out a gold watch and asked, "Can you hear this ticking?" The man replied, "Of course." The specialist walked to the door and held up the watch again. "Now can you hear it?" The man concentrated and said, "Yes, I hear it clearly." The doctor walked out the door into the next room and said, "Can you hear it now?" And the man again said, "Yes, clearly." The doctor said, "Sir, there is nothing wrong with your hearing. You've simply quit listening." Ooh. We live in a culture that is so full of gadgets that ping and ding and ring, that bleep and buzz and beep, and chime their way into our lives, trying to get our attention. And they pull us away from whatever the 2 or 3 other things we may be doing or listening to. We have become experts at living in the midst of noise and have become very good at tuning out what we determine isn't important at that time. We've simply stopped listening. With all these interruptions and distractions, how in the world are we supposed to listen for and hear the voice of God? But first, do we expect to hear from God? Do we believe that God does speak to us? We often hear what we're conditioned to hear. My father has a hearing problem, but it's amazing what he does hear. Let's face it, we make mistakes at times because we fail to listen carefully or to understand the messages that we've heard. Sometimes through fear or impatience, we block out messages altogether. How are we listening for God to speak? Are we even able to slow down enough to listen intently and hear what our initiating God is saying to us? You see, I believe God is always speaking, always calling, always nudging. In the text that we read this morning, Samuel models not only responsiveness to God, but then obedience. If you're like me, you're envious of the clarity of God's call to Samuel. I want to say that most times in our lives, hearing God's voice is not as clear as it was today, nor do we have someone in our life who is saying, you need to listen. It might be God. Samuel is very young, perhaps 11 or 12. He had been left at the temple by his mother Hannah because of her vow to do so after Samuel was born. I encourage you to read those first 2 chapters of Samuel sometime. There's a sermon in Hannah's life, I believe. Samuel was living in the temple and serving the old priest Eli, and he was learning from him. While Shiloh was once a place of God's divine presence, the temple had become a place of scandal. Eli's sons, who were also priests, had no respect for the Lord or for their duties as priest. Eli was aware of what was happening with his sons and what they were doing, and he asked them to stop their wicked ways, but his sons wouldn't listen. The Lord had sent some previous messengers to Eli to warn him of what would happen if changes were made, but nothing changed. And Samuel was likely a novice when it came to listening to God's voice. Remember, he's quite young. He appears unprepared to hear from the Lord. Samuel begins with a misunderstanding, confusing the voice of God with the voice of Eli. Not once, but 3 times. The text tells us that Samuel slept in the same room as the Ark of God, or the Ark of the Covenant. This was a very sacred place where the power of God was most present. It's during the night, and Samuel hears a voice calling. He thinks it's Eli, and he's expected to go and see what Eli wants. Samuel had no clue that God might be calling. And even though Eli had not listened to previous messages that had been sent by God, he's still a wise old priest, and he believes that God does speak to his people. He understands that it's possible to have direct contact with God. And after being awakened several times, he realizes this might be God who's actually speaking to Samuel. I wonder what it was like for both Samuel and Eli to return to sleep after these first 3 interruptions. I wonder if Eli laid there wondering what God might be wanting to say to Samuel. And I wonder what it was like for Samuel as a young boy to go back and lie down and wonder if this voice is going to speak again. And if so, that it might actually be the voice of God. In any event, Eli told Samuel that it may be God who's calling you, and that he should be ready to hear. How do we know when God is speaking to us? We must never lose sight of the fact that we have a God who wants us to know him, but at the same time does not force monologues on those of us who are unwilling. God invites us into conversation. When Samuel tells God that he's willing to listen, that's when the real connection between God and Samuel begins. God didn't force himself. Samuel showed a willingness. Do our daily prayers include a desire to hear God speaking in our lives? Are we willing to pause and be still and be quiet and to listen intently? Are we aware of a God who is searching for us? Are we awake to the one who knows and calls us by name? And one who is longing for us to listen. God knows us, and God chooses to be in relationship with us. Psalm 139 affirms God's persistent desire for relationship, no matter what we've said, what we've done. We are known completely by God, and God's knowledge of us is grounded in love. I believe that God is constantly speaking into our lives, and occasionally with words. God engages in our daily lives, and we have the opportunity to encounter God's presence in our everyday experiences. Author and speaker Paula D'Arcy says it this way: God comes to you disguised as your life. She continues, if God can make himself visible in a tiny baby in a dirty stable, then we better be ready for God just about anywhere and in anyone. Wow. That may not be the way that we'd like God to speak to us. God anywhere and in anybody? Boy, that sounds risky and hard and challenging. Perhaps we would be more comfortable with God speaking to us while we have a cup of coffee in the comfort of the recliner in our homes. And God did not give Samuel an easy task to follow. He's a young boy being told to go and tell Eli some really awful stuff. I wonder if Samuel hoped that the Lord's message was not real and wished he could forget about it, or perhaps he got the wrong message. But Samuel went to Eli and gave him the message, hard as it was. And when Eli heard the message, he responds by saying, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." Just like when we receive a phone call on our phones, we have choices. We can answer and speak to the caller. We can let it go to voicemail, and we can choose to ignore it. These are new things for some of us who are older. When the phone rang at our house, which it rarely did, we ran for the phone. We didn't know who was calling, but we eagerly wanted to know who was on the other end of that line. We didn't have the choices we have now. I mean, I can look at my phone and say, I'll let that. Have there been times in our relationship with God that we've chosen to ignore his voice instead of listening? When we should have done something, but we remained inactive? When we should have spoken, but we remained quiet and silent? None of us will ever humanly be able to answer every need. But where is God inviting you and me to listen and respond? Eli's wisdom to Samuel to keep listening with an open heart and mind. What will happen? God is active all around us, but there's mystery and there's surprise in discerning what God is saying. We sometimes doubt what we hear or sense. There's not always a straight, clear answer with a clear direction. But there are those times when something gets a hold of our heart, our minds, our hopes, and our soul. For some reason, it keeps nagging us and nudging us. It may seem that the words of the Lord are just as rare in 2018 as when Samuel was a boy, but my friend, God still speaks. The question is not whether God is calling or speaking to us, but whether we are listening. Lord, you call, but we do not always recognize your voice. Sometimes we don't listen carefully. Sometimes we're caught off guard. Lord, you call, but we haven't always taught others to hear you. Sometimes we stand in the way, allowing our voice to ring out over yours. Lord, you call, but we don't always believe our ears. Sometimes we believe we know better. Sometimes we think you can't possibly be calling us or her or him. Forgive us, Lord, for our unpracticed listening. Forgive us for our closed ears. It would be wonderful to hear the voice of God with clarity. But when we feel the nudge sometimes, we have a tendency to debate with ourselves and with others, and we struggle. We weigh the advantages of this and the disadvantages of that. We imagine the risks that it might mean or the sacrifices that we might have to make. We pray, we try to listen, but no clear answer seems to come. So we repeat that cycle. Hearing and responding to God, I'm not here to tell you, is an easy, simple thing. But it's something that takes intention, something that requires quietness and stillness. And it's not always going to be dramatic or clear or definite. And we probably all have heard stories from people who had a clear call they knew. Sometimes it's not that way. There's no guarantee that we're going to hear an audible voice as Samuel did. But we will know through silence, through struggling and discernment and listening, we will know when it is God speaking. It's a practice, it's a discipline. And in the world filled with so much noise, silence isn't easy to come by. They're rare commodities. How much listening do we do on a normal day? How many times throughout our days do we experience moments or periods of silence or quiet? Listening is a muscle that must be exercised. The more we use it, the more we understand how it works. I believe that we must pay attention to God's voice that comes through all the earthly noise. Might God be speaking when someone notices a gift you have and encourages you to use it? Could God speak through the counsel that people give when you're trying to make a decision? Might God's voice be nudging you to talk to someone that you would prefer not relating to? Might God be speaking maybe to your impatience when you get behind a slow car? In July of 2015, a person that I respect suggested that perhaps I should apply for the conference minister role at ACC. This person doesn't normally say these kinds of things. I just laughed when the person said it. Me? But the suggestion kept returning to my mind, and it wouldn't go away. I tested the suggestion with a few trusted friends and decided I'd submit an application. Nearly 6 months later, I received an invitation to accept this position as a conference minister. I felt that God had spoken to me and used other people to nudge me forward one step at a time. I'm guessing that we all have stories that we can share of how God used others to speak to us. God is constantly speaking in our lives through insights, encounters, experiences, hunches, and dreams, and inspirational thoughts, and through other people. The psalmist in Psalm 139 reminds us that God knows us and sees us individually just as well as God knew Samuel and Jesus knew his disciples. Again, God wants to be in conversation with us. How can we be ready to hear? Let's be honest, it can be risky to ask God to speak. You know what? It might change our lives if we listen and obey. Because no matter the details of the call, God always calls us away from ourselves into a new life lived in God, lived for God and for our neighbor. We may never be the same again as we listen and respond. What are you listening to? Who are you listening to? A wise counselor said, "Respect the botherment." You know how many times in a day we get bothered? Respect it, which means pay attention to what's nagging at you, what might be bugging you, what keeps coming to mind, what captures your attention. What do you keep noticing? What's God saying through all of this? The Christian journey is a life lived from inside out, a life in which the things that we experience inwardly are in constant tension with the things that we experience outwardly. This is a tension we will need to contend with all of our life. Thomas Merton writes, "To surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone in everything is to destroy the fruitfulness of our work. Frenzy, busyness, running here and there destroys our inner capacity for peace. Might it also destroy our capacity to listen?" In a devotional reading this week, one writer encouraged the church to become journeyers rather than wanderers. Can you just think a little bit what it looks like to wander around? As a journeyer, there's purpose, there's destination. As a journeyer, someone or something has likely pointed us to God's voice. Perhaps a friend, a coworker, a mentor, a Sunday school teacher, a youth leader, a pastor, perhaps a homeless person on the street, the clerk at the grocery store, a neighbor, maybe through an act of kindness, a listening ear, or quietness. The ordinary or the everyday often has a way of opening us up to the sacred. As Paula D'Arcy says, God comes disguised in our life. The interruptions and the preoccupations that clutter our days are always ways that God may choose to speak to us if we let God do that and are intent on watching and listening. And the Lord came and called as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel replied, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." I want to close by sharing a prayer with you, a prayer adapted from one that was written by Francis Roberts in a book entitled "Come Away, My Beloved." I invite you to just sit quietly, perhaps with your eyes closed, and perhaps with your hands outstretched. This is a prayer that God is inviting us into. When I finish the prayer, I invite us to just remain quiet for a few moments before we move on with the rest of the service. Hear this. My child, I say to you, wait on me. Let your life be as a deep, quiet pool. Let your heart rest in my hand as a bird in a nest. Let your eyes be still. Let your hands be free, for then I will fill all your vision. And then I will take your hands into mine, and my power will flow forth into you. Make for yourself a place apart. Yes, a place removed from the noise and the clatter. And there, I will meet you. Yes, I wait your coming. For I long to pour out my blessings on you, and I long to give you my fullness. Only be still and quiet before me. Don't let the cares and the worries of the days rob you of rich fellowship with me. I know what things you need, and I'm concerned about your every role and responsibility. You will find that your cares have vanished and your load lightened by an unseen hand. I invite you to bring me your love, and even as you are bringing to me your love, I will in turn bring you my power. I give you the power to carry out your journey with greater efficiency, and I am actively working for you in ways that you cannot see to make your path clear and to bring about things that you yourself could never accomplish. So I say to you again, rest in me. Wait on me. Come apart with me. Seek my face. Seek my fellowship. Amen.